she was accused by her employer of violating their respectful workplace policy. Nothing she did happened in the workplace, whereas these people are actually targeting a coworker. Was there any discipline to them under the respectful workplace policy, which they were actively violating clearly?
Welcome back to Northern Perspective, everybody. We have a special guest on with us today, and we came to know this individual through a very significant case that is going on out in British Columbia, where a nurse practitioner decided to get involved and advocate for women's rights, fund a billboard that said, "I love J.K. Rowling," and then all hell broke loose. So we're going to be talking to her about that and all things free speech. Lisa Bildy, welcome to Northern Perspective.
Thanks very much for having me on.
Okay, so let's go back to the beginning. So before you got involved in the Amy Hamm case, before you got involved even with the Justice Center, how did you decide to become a lawyer in the first place?
Oh my goodness. Well, that was a process of elimination. I wrote the LSAT and did well on it, not knowing what to do with a political science degree, and I thought, I guess I'll go to law school then. And I worked as just a very ordinary lawyer in a sort of small litigation firm. I did some trial work, first personal injury and family law in those early days, and then I ended up having a baby after interviewing everybody to make sure that was a good idea. I mean, it really didn't seem to have any maternal instincts, but had a complete paradigm shift. So I actually stepped outside of practice then for a very long time. I ended up homeschooling my then two sons, and then I came back to practice in 2017. So I was off for about 17 years, doing contract work and that sort of thing to keep a hand in it, but not doing a full-time practice. So.
And how did you come to be, even involved from the time that you were with the Justice Center?
So when I came back to practice, I had been in 2017. This was already sort of well into what I will say is the sort of the hot culture war, when things were really kind of becoming apparent, maybe not to everybody, but to those who were paying a little bit more close attention. And so I started following what the Law Society, my regulator, was doing as I was coming back into practice and reading the emails again. And they were bringing in something called a Statement of Principles, which was going to require all lawyers in the province to promote what I viewed was progressive values, DEI, in all aspects of their lives. And I thought, okay, those words sound nice, but I was paying enough attention that I knew that they didn't mean what they said, and that it imported basically a worldview litmus test on all lawyers in order to be actually practicing law, which violates a fundamental tenet of the rule of law, which is that the lawyers and the judiciary have to be independent, and you have to be able to represent anybody who comes before you. So Megan Murphy was already out there doing her thing, advocating for gender, for women's rights and against gender ideology, which was coming into the spotlight. And I remember making the argument, look, we have to promote inclusion. So how would you be able to represent somebody like Megan Murphy then as a lawyer? You couldn't. You wouldn't be able to, because it would be violating these tenets that you're expected to promote. So anyway, I ended up starting a campaign with some other lawyers. I spoke up at a meeting, and which was not in character necessarily, but I did. And others felt similarly, and built a little bit of a coalition, and eventually we ran a campaign to essentially take back the Law Society. And we didn't get enough for a majority, but we managed to get rid of the Statement of Principles. So.
Well, that's a victory in itself. So.
It was an early victory too, and I think it made a lot of people kind of realize that you could do something about this, and it also brought a lot of this to people's attention a bit more. And there were other things happening around the same time, like Lindsay Shepherd's case,
Right.
and anyway, after that, I reached out to the Justice Center and said, hey, I'm kind of enjoying fighting for free speech, and if you got anything you want to send my way, I'm starting a new practice. And next thing I knew, I was on staff. So.
Now, when did you get involved or really hear about the Amy Hamm case? Like Amy Hamm, she's an advocate for women's rights. She's written multiple articles for the National Post, but when it came specifically to her case, how did you become aware of it?
So this was going on for years already before it really got into the public eye. And both Amy and Megan Murphy were planning some events back in, I mean, it was early days of COVID or even before, and they were starting to get canceled. They were getting protests, or venues were shutting them down, and so the Justice Center was getting involved in helping them to find venues or like push back against the cancellation attempts and so on. So she was already kind of a client of the Justice Center when she participated in putting up this billboard, I Heart J.K. Rowling, and then of course the cancellation mob did its thing, and people found out she was a nurse, and complaints came into her college. There was an investigation that went on for quite a long time, and then they pulled together all of the communications that she had online, her tweets, her articles that she'd written, her podcasts, and put together this 300 plus page dossier of everything that was essentially gender critical. I mean, they didn't sort of define which things crossed a line in their view or didn't. It was just anything to do with gender was in this dossier. And I started representing her at that time. I wrote a letter to the college and started advocating for her at that point. And then it heated up to a disciplinary hearing, and that lasted for a very long time. So by then I had left the Justice Center, gone out on my own. They continued to fund it graciously. And but Amy was my client, and she's stayed with me, and we still have some battles ahead. So.
Right, because that disciplinary decision came down, I believe, in March of this year. Is that
Yes.
correct? And in it essentially penalized her to the tune of $100,000, around that figure, from what I saw. Is that correct?
Well, so what came down in March was the finding that there was unprofessional conduct.
Right.
And so I'll just talk about that maybe for a second, because we're already appealing that. That's already now before the BC Supreme Court. Will be moving it forward now that we have the penalty decision, which I'll talk about next. But the finding was a very lengthy decision. The panel went through, the college had been asked to kind of refine their 330 pages down to something that they really felt crossed the line. They still had something, if I recall correctly, like around 180 pages. So there was still a ton of stuff. And we went through all of that in this lengthy hearing. And essentially what the college's position was that any criticism of gender ideology or any attempt to advocate for women's rights that was not also inclusive of transgender women was essentially unprofessional conduct. Now, the panel decided that they didn't like much of her speech, but they were only going to penalize, there were, I think, 4 different items where she had explicitly identified herself as a nurse in her bio. She'd written a couple of articles, and it wasn't like, I'm writing this as a nurse and this is what I think. It was, at the bottom, it was Amy Hamm as a mom, a nurse, and lives in New Westminster. So very tangential. But that was enough of a hook for them to say, you are embarrassing the nursing profession, essentially. So there were those 4 items. The rest they didn't punish her on. But for those, we then got the penalty decision after we made some further submissions. That came out just last month, and they ordered a 1-month suspension of her license, as well as costs, and that's what this $93,500 is that she's expected to pay. And the college had wanted over $160,000. There's provision in the legislation and the regulations that says how much they're entitled to when they, if they're successful. So we did manage to work it down a fair bit, but it's still very punitive in effect, right? It's not part of the punishment, but it is.
Now, this is where, because we took a look at not the whole decision, because it is fairly long, as you mentioned, but there were some parts that jumped out at us. And one part is where it's evident that the cancel culture mob mentality was infiltrated into the panel, where they actually admit that she has received no complaints about her practice, no complaints from patients. So the question comes down to, well, then how can this body justify penalizing her for unprofessional conduct when there's no criticism of her professional conduct. That's basically where this comes down to. And is that the question that you're asking as well, which is why this is being appealed?
Yes, well, in recent years, I'm not sure if it was always this way, but the various regulatory bodies across the country, many of them, have become much more active in policing the speech of their licensees. And they can sort of argue, well, we have a duty to govern in the public interest, and we have a duty to protect the reputation of the regulator of the profession. We don't want people bringing the profession into disrepute, and that has led to then kind of finding ways to hook what people say off duty under their remit. And so basically, if they think that there's some sort of a nexus is the word. If there's a nexus between what's been said and the profession, then they'll pull it under their jurisdiction in effect and feel that they can punish somebody for that. What I find rather appalling about the whole thing is that it's very selective and very political now. And so we have seen a couple of generations now of people who have adopted a particular worldview that get now into these professional positions, these regulatory positions. And so when somebody complains from the public or whatever about particular speech, if it's speech they don't like, then they'll go after it very hard. Now, obviously we see these double standards all the time now. It's much more evident, but in Amy's case, so she also lost her job. She had worked at the Vancouver Vancouver Coastal Health, I think for 13 years with no patient complaints whatsoever. But a group of her colleagues, not people she knew or worked daily with, but just other people in the hospital who didn't like her views either. They ran an online campaign on Instagram trying to get everybody to call in complaints about Amy. These people, if you sort of look at who's involved in this group, as we did a little digging, and almost all of them are out there advocating what we would probably say are fairly extreme left-wing radical views, and also identifying as nurses, social workers, whatever their positions are, sometimes even identifying themselves as working for the hospital, but no consequences to them for anything that they're saying.
So how is that professional conduct to try to get people to complain about a colleague about you? How is that professional, and what Amy did was unprofessional? Like that's the inconsistency issue.
Well, exactly. And she was accused by her employer of violating their respectful workplace policy. Nothing she did happened in the workplace, whereas these people are actually targeting a coworker. Was there any discipline to them under the respectful workplace policy, which they were actively violating clearly? No, not a bit.
So does this set a precedent for other professions like doctors, lawyers, veterinarians, etc.?
Well, certainly it does, but I think it's been happening in a lot of those professions as well. And what I'm concerned about, too, is that we don't hear the half of it. I think what happens with a lot of people, because I've seen enough, and I've been involved in enough situations where, so I know it's happening, but I think it's happening a lot more than we know. And that is, a complaint comes in, or it just becomes known to somebody at the regulator of whatever profession, whatever province, and they'll do an investigation, and they'll say these tweets are inappropriate, or these comments are inappropriate, you need to take it down, or they'll sometimes, like, rather than sending it to discipline, if they can get the professional to agree to either go private with their account, take certain posts down, undertake not to do it again. Sometimes they'll have to do a little retraining program. They go and do a professionalism course online or something, or a social media training course. And it doesn't go on their professional discipline record. There might be some indication of it, depending on how far it's gone, depending on the college and their rules. But anyway, I think that's happening a lot, where people are they get called out, they can't risk their profession, they don't want to fight, and look at the costs associated with it when you do fight. If you do say, look, this isn't right, I'm not going to sign something essentially saying I'm transphobic because I've been advocating for women's rights, my conscience won't allow me to do that, I'm going to fight. And thankfully, you've got somebody like the Justice Center funding the fight, so you can actually do stand up for yourself. But I mean, the vast majority of people don't have that luxury, because they will look at those consequences and they'll say, I just can't afford that. And you also see it's not just doctors and lawyers who might be able to afford. I mean, even for most doctors and lawyers, it would be prohibitive, but they would have a better chance of maybe affording to have private counsel. But you see, now we've got the regulation is hitting so many different areas of work now, down to paramedics, and I don't mean hierarchically down, but I just mean like it's going to much broader professions than it ever used to. Daycare workers are licensed in some places, so you're going to have an awful lot of people who are not making the kind of money that would enable them to fight back, now under the thumb of a select group of people, which, I mean, the regulators might be fine in many places and in many professions, but there are enough of them now that have been infected with this kind of, thinking that they are there to control people's speech, but only certain speech. And so my position is, look, they shouldn't have that power at all. They're abusing it.
Yeah, and I belong to a professional body, the Ontario Association of Veterinary Technicians, even though I haven't been in practice for over a decade now, but I do keep my license active. And it makes you wonder, what about for people who are part of these professions that, maybe they keep an active license, but they're not necessarily, active in that job, but they're posting things online. Like, are these bodies trying to control them as well?
Yeah, I haven't seen it so much with people who have licenses that are kind of on hold, but they'd have the power to. I mean, if you're a member of that profession, whether you're a practicing member or just sort of on administrative leave, you're under their jurisdiction essentially. So yeah, watch what you say.
So how do we stop that in Canada? Because you would think that our Charter rights to free speech would supersede that.
Well, that's what you would think, but it's not the reality, unfortunately. Our charter has now been interpreted in ways that, well, there's two problems. We have something called the limitations clause. So our speech rights are not nearly as robust as they are in the United States. So we have a guarantee, essentially, that we have the right to express ourselves. It's subject to limits that can be demonstrably justified in a free and democratic society. And I think where our courts and administrative tribunals and so on have spent most of their time in the last while is figuring out how broad we can make those limits rather than how much can we support the underlying guarantee. And then the other problem that you have is that a lot of the administrative bodies now are the front lines. They're the ones making these decisions about whether something is entitled to charter protection or not. They're not necessarily experts on this. You got a panel of doctors deciding whether someone's constitutional rights are to be infringed or not, but they are making those decisions. And then if you try to judicially review it, the courts have, over many years, developed a sort of test of reasonableness. And so if the decision, maybe it's not the way they would have ruled, but if it's reasonable, then they will defer to the panel below, as though they have some expertise. But they don't necessarily, they might have expertise on whether, as a veterinary technician, you should have done this or that with the animal. That's maybe where their expertise is, but it isn't necessarily on the charter. But they're being deferred to nonetheless. And so I think what happens is that an awful lot of people, and not even just the professions, but we see it in other areas too, in school boards dealing with parents and other social workers and other sort of frontline administrative people, the bureaucracy, the managerial class, having this power to deal with the average person in their day-to-day lives with power to penalize them essentially for saying something that they ought not to have in their view. And then the recourse is to try and judicially review it, and you're going to likely be unsuccessful.
So one of the things that the panel and particularly their expert that they brought in were focusing on is a comment made by Amy that women can't have penises. So this is the part that it threw me for a loop, because you have these people that are trained in the medical profession, trained in biology, and they regarded that statement as untrue in this hearing. So how does that even square? Because you have people talking about a biological fact as being now untrue. So what was the reaction? Like, how do you even attempt to argue against a statement like that that's so I don't even know what to call it. It is just so far from reality.
Well, this is interesting because things are getting redefined all over the place, right? Including the nature of biology and the reproductive binary. I spent probably half a day with one of the college's experts arguing over a definition of female, because they were saying, well, women can be inclusive of, it's a social category. And I said, okay, well, let's talk about female. I want a definition of female. And she was all over the place with me on this, because they don't agree that sex is a binary. They don't agree that basically it's a question of, do you have large gametes or small gametes? They now believe that sex is multivariable, okay, that there are other factors that come in. So Dr. Bauer was one of the college's experts, and she had a whole chart she's done up on what sex is now. And so you've got hormones, and you've got chromosomal sex, and you've got other characteristics, and then there's expressions of those things. And so she gave some examples. If you are a woman who has given birth to sons, you might have some male DNA floating, mitochondrial DNA floating around in you. What did she call it? Mycochimera or something like this. But that doesn't make you, Mom, the man, a man now, right? Or a male. Another example was how in older males, they start to lose some of their Y chromosomes. And so, but that doesn't turn grandpa into a woman. I mean, so they've got some, or a woman has a hysterectomy. Is she now no longer a woman? I mean, those are the kinds of things that they put out there to suggest that the new biology is very multifactorial or multivariable. But it doesn't change the fact that there's nothing besides, and I asked her this question, is there something besides large gametes and small gametes? She said no gametes. So I guess that's the third sex. So anyway, the short answer is they don't view it as being a fact anymore. They've got new facts.
Because this has been, I think, at the crux of the debate for the last, I would say, 10 years when it comes to gender ideology. And this is where the discussion always ends up going when you're talking to somebody like this, and they say, well, gender is a spectrum, but sex is binary. That used to be what they were saying. So the fact that you have doctors now trying to say that, no, it's not just gender, gender is sex, and sex is like that. Okay, so they would have to then explain the rest of nature at that point. So are you trying to say that if you're applying this to people, then you're saying that no species out there is binary in male and female, and this is where it gets yeah, but. Yeah, but
clownfish.
Right.
Forget about all the dogs and cats and deer, and I wonder sometimes if people ought not to watch a little bit more Animal Planet and a little less, other stuff.
Watch some David Attenborough.
Yeah, but no, I mean it's just this is the new biology. You're talking about old-fashioned biology. If you learned it in grade 10 biology, it's dated now.
Okay, well that's it's disturbing.
It is, and so on the experts too, because. We touched on that, and that's a whole other interesting issue. The college brought in two experts who basically talked about how exclusive it was to say that only women, or that women cannot have penises, because sometimes there are female penises apparently, and so my co-counsel and I spent a lot of time cross-examining these witnesses. Oftentimes when, as a lawyer, you're cross-examining an expert, you don't really want to get into their turf too much because they know their stuff and you don't, right? As much as you might research it, they're the expert. And so you cross-examine around their reputations, about the numbers of papers they published and things like that, and you try and do a little bit of damage here and there. The strategy was to let them speak and let the vast audience that was watching this every day hear some of this. It didn't change the outcome, but it was very interesting to hear. So things like lesbians can have penises, or sometimes one of the questions was about lesbians being sometimes being transphobic by not accepting that somebody a potential partner who presents female might not have the parts that normally lesbians are attracted to. So it's actually a very discriminatory philosophy or ideology for gays and lesbians, because essentially you're saying you're transphobic because you have a particular preference. So anyway, we did get into that with some of the some of the questioning, and there were some other shocking, mind-blowing answers on different things. But yes, if you advocate for women's rights and do not include trans women, you are being transphobic, is essentially the opinion that they had and that the panel accepted.
Well, and it's shocking to me that oftentimes they try to make the exception the rule. Like, we do know that sometimes babies are born with an extra chromosome, or they're missing a chromosome, or maybe they've got 2 extra chromosomes that maybe they physically don't present as male or female, maybe they're intersex, but they try to make that the rule. It's like if I asked, I'm going to flip this coin, is it going to be heads or tails? Nobody thinks to answer that maybe it lands on its edge, which it could.
Or it's even worse than that. They'll say it's both, right? Yeah. They'll say it's heads and tails at the same time. Yeah. But to your point about the gay community, we're actually seeing this more and more, is people that identify themselves as a gay person or a lesbian are now coming in and saying, listen, I was on that team until they started coming at me because I'm not going to be attracted to a trans woman, a biological male. And to your point, they started being labeled as transphobic, and the community came after them. So this is the bizarre thing, is that this community itself is now being hijacked and ripped apart from the inside because people have their sexual preferences, and now they're being challenged on that by the minority, or even by people that aren't even trans to begin with.
Yes, exactly. Well, that was another point that Amy was making, is that, look, I'm not attacking trans people. I'm attacking trans ideology and activism, and that's not necessarily the same thing. And we tried to also point out that, look, this is a very aggressive battle. So it's not that Amy's going out and just being mean for the sake of being mean. If you look at the context in which she's, and the the surrounding milieu in which she's fighting for women's rights, and you see this with J.K. Rowling as well, the hate and abuse that is doled out and that she is kind of having to respond to is really quite extreme. And we did get some of that in as evidence, just some screenshots of things, that the death threats and the rape threats, and again, it's not just transgender people that are that someone's just randomly attacking. It's the idea that you cannot even speak up on women's rights and biological women's rights without being attacked mercilessly on the other side, but you're the only one who's going to get punished for it because that group is marginalized and can't be challenged. The other thing about experts that I will say is 2 of our experts, actually, one were gay, and not that was the primary reason for their being there. They were also excellent experts, but the college challenged us on all of our experts. They did not want us to have any experts, essentially. So a lot of the fighting that we did was behind the scenes, writing written submissions to try and keep our experts in. And we ended up losing Dr. Miriam Grossman. The panel decided that she was not sufficiently, she didn't qualify. You have to be qualified as an expert by the panel and not be in any way biased, or that have the expertise that's relevant to the case. I can't remember the specific grounds on which she was excluded, but it certainly wasn't because she doesn't know her stuff. She does. But we ended up with Dr. James Cantor coming in, who was, to me, a breath of fresh air in his testimony during that proceeding. But the panel was very critical of his testimony and not so much of the college's experts. So again, you sort of see that double standard playing out even just with the experts.
Well, and it's interesting because it seems the longer that this ideology persists, the more that it actually clashes and subverts women's rights. And this was, I think, on full display when Amy was talking about this term penis people, basically referring to men. And she was essentially told by the panel that was discriminatory and it was unprofessional. Yet, to your earlier point, where the ideology is hijacking language and changing language, There's new terms for women: menstruators, birthing people. Even the acts of breastfeeding has been changed to chest feeder, like chest feeding, or you're a chest feeder. So the bizarre thing is making those derogatory terms for women seems to be a-okay,
Yes.
but when you essentially create almost the equivalent term for the men, now it becomes discriminatory. So is that what you and Amy are seeing here? Like, this is more of an attack on women's rights than anything.
Oh, absolutely. And that was one of the things we were saying in the hearing as well, because we pointed to the language guide that the college had come out with, and that was something she'd been critical of online. And so we did spend some time on that, and how women might feel being sort of relegated to body parts as opposed to, the being a mother, or just, that somehow that's taboo now. Because transgender women are not, are not biological women. We've now had to erase anything that relates to, well, what it means to be a woman, and put it in body part terms. It's anyway. We did spend some time on that topic, and I don't think the panel was too impressed with those arguments. But we said essentially, look, women are also being essentially marginalized here, and why can't she advocate for that marginalized group? They have specific needs, even in the Human Rights Code, which they're saying it's discriminatory to criticize trans people under the code. But it's also, you are entitled under the Human Rights Code, at least in BC and probably most places, to have segregated places for specific groups if it's done for bona fide reasons that relate to things like modesty and so on. So, that's allowed actually, but apparently we're going to just ignore that.
And by our interpretation of the decision, it looks like the panel relied almost exclusively on third-party reports and not any patient complaints as it related to Amy. Do you think that was a fair process, or do you think this was predetermined from the beginning?
Well, I mean, the process, there was due process. I mean, she did have a full hearing, and you can't. I'm not going to disparage the panel. They heard all the evidence, and they were there to make a decision, and they made a decision. And we don't always like the decision. Someone always has to lose. I think it's unfortunate that this was prompted by strangers on the internet complaining, because I don't think that should be allowed. I don't think that regulatory bodies should be weaponized in that fashion, but they are. And it's not just in Amy's case. I'm seeing it we saw it with Dr. Jordan Peterson,
Yep.
and another client of mine, Dr. Kulvinder Gill in Ontario, had, a series of complaints about her comments during COVID about lockdown harms. Again, people in the United States were complaining and so on. And the colleges, what they do is they take those complaints and then they go on and do an investigation of their own. So the complaints themselves really didn't get much traction in the hearing in Amy's case. Nobody really cared. It was just that it was what prompted the college to do an investigation, and that's where they then go online. They call and produce this record of a forensic report, they say, of all of these comments that are online, and pull that all together. And so that becomes the focus. Very little attention was paid at all to these complaints. One was still anonymous to Amy. She didn't know who had complained. And the other one was somebody who he had signed his name, and we got to see his name, but he described himself on LinkedIn as a social justice activist and Marxist. So, as you'd expect.
Well, because if you follow the pattern of what has been happening with free speech, it really follows that pattern of what happened in virtually every single country that fell to communism, Marxist-Leninism. There's a million different terms for it, and they all say it's different, but it's essentially extreme socialism, to the point where they must subvert any language that is disagreeable to their ideology, and it's very cult-like, actually, in terms of the behavior. We've Tanya and I, behind the scenes, we're fascinated with the pervasiveness of cults in especially Western society, and we've watched many documentaries on it. And there's a very eerie similarity to the rules or the practices that cults employ in terms of changing people's language, making people uncomfortable just enough, and if you disagree with that, then you're shamed and isolated. And then you look at what's happening on a societal scale with something like this, and it's very, very similar and eerie. So, and in a way, that's communism in practice as well. It's just a cult on a societal scale. Right. Are you seeing any similarities, the same as we are, and even more broad outside of this, when it comes to free speech? What are you seeing happening in the West?
Oh, lots of great questions there. Well, when you were talking about communism, the one thought that came to mind was Lysenko. And if your viewers aren't familiar, you should Google it. But Lysenkoism was during Stalin's time, when essentially the well-known science, biology, again, it was biologists under attack, but it was in terms of plant biology. And this new way of developing crops was being promoted by the government, which ultimately ended up in everybody starving. But if you were a biologist who was promoting the actual science around plant biology, you were getting put into the gulag, or some were killed. The parallels there are rather alarming as well. How the state can decide, this is science, we're doing it this way, and if you think otherwise, off to the gulag with you. And in terms of cults, I mean, I sort of see that to some degree, but it's also just this. I don't think most people are in a cult. I think that there are some who probably are. There's an inner circle of people who may be, but most people are just, I guess it's called preference falsification. They think everybody agrees with this. They kind of go along to get along, and I think that tends to be the nature of humans. When we had our Law Society battle, one of the poignant essays that I read at the time, and which I highlighted with our people who are following our posts, was The Power of the Powerless by Václav Havel, who became the Czech president, but who was a dissident during the communist times, and who wrote about how shopkeepers would have a sign in the window that said, "Workers of the world unite." And the greengrocer might not actually agree with those words, but it was done. He put it in the window for two reasons. One was to show the people above him that he was falling in line and was not going to be a problem. And it was also to send a message to basically other people out there that that he was this was the language to use, and he was on the right side of things, and people did that. That's what they did until it became okay to not have that sign in the window anymore, and there was enough of a breakthrough of reality for people to be able to start speaking again. But he also talks in that essay about how important it is to sort of maintain alternative institutions during totalitarian times or post-totalitarian times, to basically to kind of keep a light shining for reality, and for people to look to eventually when they kind of are able to break free and have a foundation ready to go for when that cloud of totalitarianism lifts. I don't know that we're fully in it yet. We're getting there. I don't know how dark it's going to get before we come out. I look at the UK. They seem really dystopian at the moment, with police spending vast resources going after people for their tweets, whereas the crime rates are out of control. And I think that's often what we sort of feel here, that attention is not paid to the things that actually keep us safe, but we're talking about harm from words. And we're all of probably a vintage where we remember the old phrase, "Sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me." And we've forgotten that. Now everybody is crumbled and unable to cope if they hear words that they don't like. We've also lost the ability then to be able to have to engage in debate and discussion about policies. This whole Bill C-16 that came in that essentially took away women's rights, I don't think people understood necessarily that was going to be the result. A few people may have thought so, but I suspect that most people kind of pushing it in thought, okay, well, this is being nice to people who are gender diverse. But, the two are incompatible. You can't have gender identity prevailing because it's going to affect sex. we see it, of course, in women's prisons and women's sports and all these things. If you're going to prioritize gender, it's going to be at the expense of sex. And but we couldn't have a conversation about that because we were already in fairly censorious times when that was being pushed through in 2016, 2015. And we certainly still can't, obviously. Amy's case shows that. We can't have a debate about it. But we should, and we need to, because these are political decisions. During Amy's case, counsel for the college, her name is Barbara Finley, blurted out at one point, there is no debate, because I said we should be able to talk about these. There is no debate in Canada. There is no debate. Well, there never was, and they want to keep it that way. But that is not how a democracy works. You need to be able to have a push and pull of ideas. You need to be able to figure out what the best ones are in order to be able to think at a level that allows you to come to your own conclusions. You need to be able to speak. You need to be able to formulate your thoughts, discuss them with people, bounce them around, realize that maybe you need to refine something, you don't know something. You cannot be a good thinker without free speech. And if you got a whole bunch of people who can't think, well, guess what? They're going to be led very easily down paths that are not for their best interests. And I think that's happening. How do I feel about free speech? So I have just, along with some others, started something called the Free Speech Union in Canada. The United Kingdom has one. They have grown exponentially over the last 5 years because people are frightened of what's happening. And they want to have an organization in their corner that's going to help them fight back when they get into trouble. I started it from my own perspective. I got involved in setting up a sister chapter here because I see so many cases like this where people can't afford to fight. And there are some good organizations out there, but we need more. There are more cases than can be funded by a single group. And we have a singular focus as well. We're just focusing on speech, not all the other charter rights. And we're also, because we're not a charity, we have a bit broader mandate. So a couple of cases that we do have, we're actually suing for damages. So it's not just a charter case. It's not a charter case at all, but we're going after a couple of universities that have put their students through the ringer for having the wrong views. And we're suing for damages. So as we're able to, we have a little bit more flexibility in the kinds of cases that we can do. But like the UK version, I am sort of expecting that this will become very essential and probably we'll end up with a lot of members joining us who feel that they want to have that sort of insurance in their back pocket that someone's going to be in their corner when something happens to them. So.
And where can Canadians learn more about your organization?
They can go to fsucanada.ca. And you can join as a member. It's a member-based organization, as they all are. We have now 5 chapters around the world, but more coming. Basically all in countries where there was free speech, but it's backsliding. We're seeing this all over Europe, certain countries in South America and so on too. So we're trying to help sort of coordinate globally as well, because a lot of these threats seem to be happening in lockstep around the world. So we can work and support each other. So, but they're all member-based organizations, so people can sign up for a year's membership, and that allows certain perks, but also just you're a part of this movement. You're helping essentially to crowdfund and disperse the cost of fighting back and helping your fellow Canadians to defend free speech where it needs to be defended, and hopefully you never have to yourself, but if you do, you've got somebody there in your corner. And then, of course, we accept donations and so on, too. It's not, we actually could really use some donations. So if anybody is listening and has some deep pockets and wants to support a great cause, we want to get some people hired. We want to make sure we're battle ready and able to fight wherever we're needed.
Yeah, and it's interesting because we hear a lot about what's going on in the UK. What we don't hear a lot about is what's going on in Germany, which is even worse, because at least in the UK, for the time being, you can still criticize the government and they won't come knock on your door. But in Germany, you can't. If you do criticize the government, they will actually sue you for criticizing their government. That's how far free speech has gone in Germany. And again, it's very eerie because we're not even 100 years from World War II, where that's exactly what was happening in that same country. So to your point, we must be vigilant in defending free speech, because if we don't stand up and defend it, nobody will. And then if nobody's defending it, that's how we lose it. And in talking to a couple of other people, if we lose the freedom of speech, we effectively surrender every other freedom as well, because we lose the ability to actually fight for it.
Exactly, exactly. And one of the worries that I see is just how much so many of the Western governments in particular are actually going after their own people. I mean, our state is there, I think, it should be there, to defend its people from external threats and to, because of their monopoly on the use of force, to keep people safe from other people, right? So that we don't have to go back to vigilantism and duels in the streets and things like this in order to have justice. We need to be assured that justice will be done in our own countries. But what we're seeing is very distorted justice now. We're seeing double standards. We're seeing a heavy hand against certain people, but a light touch or no justice when it's other groups that are more protected. That is very damaging to the concept of the rule of law, under which we should all be treated equally under and before the law. And that is not what we have anymore in Canada. We have this equity notion where some groups, looking at everything through an oppression lens, are eternally marginalized, and other groups are eternally oppressors, and the laws must be applied differently. It's really damaging to our society, and we really need to get away from all of that. But I mean, we have a lot of problems. But there are a lot of battles to fight, but I agree that free speech is kind of the bulwark, and if we lose that, we can't fight for the other things either. So we might as well at least focus on that topic and on that issue and do what we can to try and preserve that. But I don't know why our governments are now so much more focused internally on making sure people can't have the rights that they are allegedly guaranteed, and I don't quite know how we get out of that, but we absolutely need to be vigilant, and we need to keep those lights burning for people who might start to wake up and realize that there's a problem and want to know that there's people out there that they can look to.